All right, let's travel back to August 1715. We're in the Palace of Versailles, the most opulent, perfumed, and gossip-fueled place on earth. But beneath the layers of expensive floral scents and general aristocratic funk, a new scent is emerging. And trust me, it's not a good one. It's coming from the royal bedchamber, from the king himself. Because Louis XIV, the Sun King, the man who was the literal center of the European universe, is rotting alive. For 72 years, this man was the definition of power. He was the state. This was a man who wouldn't just tell you what to think, he'd tell you where to stand while you were thinking it. His control was absolute. So how does that guy, the ultimate micromanager, end up dying from something as basic and disgusting as a leg that's, well, you know, checking out before the rest of him? More importantly, why, when his very capable doctors offered him the one simple, albeit brutal choice that could have saved his life, did he look them in the eye and give them a hard no? To understand his bizarre decision, we first have to understand the gilded prison he had built for himself. The bizarre theater of Versailles, where even going to the bathroom was a public performance. Then we'll meet the royal doctors whose best medical advice involved a whole lot of flushing the system, if you catch my drift. And finally, we'll confront the spectacular royal pride, a force of nature apparently much stronger than gangrene. Because as we're about to find out, thinking you're a god on earth doesn't stop your body from reminding you that you are in fact very, very mortal. So how does the most powerful, most controlling, most obsessively organized man in all of Europe end up dying in one of the most disgusting, powerless, and chaotic ways imaginable? How does the Sun King, a man who commanded armies with the flick of a wrist, lose a war against his own leg? It's a bizarre question, and the answer, funnily enough, has almost nothing to do with the leg itself. The answer is locked away in the world he built, a world of gold and mirrors, of absolute power and absolute paranoia. A world where the king's body wasn't actually his own. To understand why Louis XIV allowed himself to rot, you first have to understand his home. And I don't use that word lightly. This wasn't a house. It was a statement. It was a weapon. It was the Palace of Versailles. Now it's easy to look at Versailles and just see, a ridiculous amount of gold leaf and some very questionable interior design choices. It's the ultimate billionaire's McMansion. But you have to remember, Versailles wasn't built just to be pretty. It was built out of fear. When Louis was a child, a series of civil wars known as the Fronde ripped France apart. The nobility, his own powerful cousins and dukes, rose up against the crown. They stormed his palace in Paris. They held him and his mother under a kind of house arrest. And a young Louis learned a very, very important lesson. A rebellious French nobleman with a castle and an army is a very, very big problem. A French nobleman who is broke living in your house and totally dependent on you for everything is not. So he built Versailles. He moved the entire court a few dozen miles outside of Paris into this enormous gilded cage. He invited, or rather commanded, thousands of the most powerful people in France to come and live with him. And just like that, he neutered the entire aristocracy. Instead of plotting rebellions in their own domains, they were now stuck at Versailles plotting how to get a better bedroom or how to get invited to the king's private dinner. It was a masterstroke of political genius. He turned warriors into gossips, and life at this new court was, well, it was insane. It was the most brutal high school cafeteria you can possibly imagine, except everyone is wearing a wig the size of a poodle, and the stakes aren't just social ruin, but financial and political oblivion. Your entire life, your family's fortune, your future, all depended on one thing catching the king's eye, gaining his favor. And how did you do that? By playing the game. And the game was a set of rituals so complex, so detailed, and so utterly bizarre that it governed every single second of the day. This brings us to the most important rule in our story. The king's body is not private. Ever. It was a public instrument of the state. Consider the ceremony of the lever, the king's waking up. This wasn't just a guy rolling out of bed. This was a 2-hour theatrical production with a cast of hundreds. It happened in stages. The first stage, the petit lever, was for the most elite his family, his doctors, a few select favorites. They would watch him be woken up, watch him say his prayers. Then came the grand lever. The doors would be thrown open, and a flood of courtiers, dozens of them, would pour in to watch the king get washed, shaved, and dressed, and every single action was an honor. The man who got to hand the king his shirt for the day he was the most powerful man in France that morning. The person who got to hold the candlestick while the king put on his breeches, a political superstar. It was the original 24/7 reality TV show, and Louis was the executive producer, the director, and the star all rolled into one. He had perfected the art of turning his own mundane biology into political theater. His every breath, his every meal, his every trip to the royal commode, was a public spectacle, a carefully choreographed dance of power. And this right here is the seed of his destruction. Because if your every waking moment is a public performance of health and divine authority, what happens when you get sick? What happens when the divine body starts to fail? It can't be a private matter. It becomes another act in the play, another public crisis for the entire court to watch and whisper about and scheme over. This is the stage upon which our tragedy will unfold. Now let's meet our leading man properly. By 1715, Louis XIV is 76 years old. He has been king for 72 of those years, longer than anyone in European history. He has outlived his own son and his grandson. His heir is his great-grandson, a little boy of 5. The Sun King is old. And despite the godlike image he projects, his body is a roadmap of a very long, very difficult life. A humorous but historically accurate animated cutaway showing a diagram of Louis with his various ailments highlighted. Let's do a quick medical rundown, shall we? He suffered from agonizing gout, which made his joints swell up to the size of apples. He had recurring fevers, boils, and kidney stones. And his teeth. Oh, his teeth. Let's just say that 18th century dentistry was less of a science and more of a form of aggressive carpentry. After a particularly nasty series of extractions, Louis was left with a broken jaw and a permanent hole in the roof of his mouth, a hole that connected his sinus to his palate. It meant that every time he drank something, part of it would come out of his nose, unless the hole was plugged with a wad of linen. So this is our protagonist. On the outside, an immortal god king. On the inside, a collection of painful, patched-up ailments, held together by sheer, unrelenting willpower. And the most important part of that willpower was his pride, his stubbornness. This was a man who had never been told no, and had certainly never admitted defeat, a key character flaw that will soon become a fatal one. Our other key players are waiting in the wings. First, you have the court itself. Think of them as a flock of exquisitely dressed vultures circling, waiting. Their entire existence depends on the king. His health is their stock market, and it's about to crash. Then you have his chief physician, Guy Crescent Fagan. Fagan was a brilliant man for his time. He was at the absolute peak of 18th century medical knowledge. Unfortunately, the peak of 18th century medical knowledge was mostly just wrong. The guiding principle of medicine was the theory of the 4 humors, the idea that the body was filled with 4 liquids and illness was caused by them being out of balance. Their solution to pretty much everything: get something out of the body any way you can. They were obsessed with purges, with laxatives, with enemas, and of course with bloodletting. Their entire medical strategy was to basically drain their patients of everything they had and hope for the best. And as we will soon see, when faced with a real aggressive internal decay, this strategy was going to be spectacularly, fatally useless. And finally, lurking in the shadows, you have the last resort of the desperate. When the best official medicine fails, when the esteemed doctors can only shake their heads, that's when the whispers start. Whispers of a miracle, cure of a secret elixir of a man from the provinces who can do what the king's own physicians cannot. That's when the charlatan with a bottle of promises gets his moment in the spotlight, and we will most certainly be meeting him later. So the world is established. The stage is the gilded prison of Versailles. The star is an aging, stubborn god-king who believes his own hype. The rules of the game are a bizarre public ritual where the king's private body and the nation's public health are one and the same. And the supporting cast is a mix of terrified doctors and scheming courtiers. The entire system is a powder keg of pride, fear, and ritual just waiting for a spark. The stage is set. The actors are in place. All that's needed is for the first shadow of the final act to fall. And in the sweltering heat of August 1715, it arrived not with a clap of thunder, but with a simple, nagging pain in the king's left leg. A tiny flicker of mortality that would soon ignite into the final grotesque inferno of his reign. We have seen the stage, the gilded, suffocating theater of Versailles. We have met our star, the aging Sun King, a man whose public image as a god was at war with his private reality as a frail, ailing man. The rules of the game have been set, a bizarre system where a king's life is a public performance. Now the final act begins. The story of the death of Louis XIV is a 5-act tragedy of denial, pride, and desperation. And it starts, as so many tragedies do, with a moment that seemed utterly insignificant. Act 1, the first shadow. The date is August 10th, 1715. It is hot. Louis, at the respectable age of 76, is still trying to project the image of the vigorous warrior king he once was. He spends the day on horseback hunting one of his great passions. He returns to the palace in the evening, tired but satisfied. It is then that he feels it, a dull, persistent pain in his left leg. Now, for a man like Louis, pain was an old and familiar courtier. He'd lived with the searing agony of gout for decades. He'd passed kidney stones the size of small pebbles. He'd had his jaw broken by a clumsy dentist. To him, a simple ache in his leg was a minor annoyance, an impertinent subject that needed to be put in its place. He did what he always did. He ignored it, fully expecting it to bow to his royal will and vanish by morning. For a day or two, it seemed to work. The pain was a background noise easily dismissed, but the shadow had fallen, and it was not going to leave. Act 2, the diagnosis. Within a week, the pain was no longer a background noise. It was a loud, insistent drumbeat that kept him awake at night. The royal physicians, led by his trusted, if somewhat useless, chief doctor, Guy Crescent Fagin, were summoned. They did what they always did. They massaged the leg with warm, scented cloths. They prescribed special therapeutic baths. They likely advised a gentle purging of the system, just in case. But nothing worked. The pain intensified. Then came the sign that sent a wave of cold panic through the inner circle of the court. The leg began to change. First, it was a faint, reddish hue. Then dark, purplish blotches started to appear on his calf and thigh like a map of some terrible new country. And it was cold. While the rest of his body burned with a low fever, the leg was icy to the touch. The whispers in the gilded hallways of Versailles turned from gossip about affairs and promotions to hushed, terrified speculation about the king's leg. Fagin knew he was out of his depth. He summoned a council of the top surgeons in Paris. Imagine that scene, a group of the most esteemed medical men in the kingdom, huddled in a corner examining the limb of a living god and seeing only death. After hours of hushed debate, it was Fagin who had to perform the terrible duty of telling the king the truth. The diagnosis was senile gangrene, gangrene of old age, a simple, brutal explanation. The flesh on the king's leg, starved of blood, was dying. It was decay. It was rot. And it would spread. It would creep up his body until it reached his torso, and then it would kill him. There was only one horrifying, terrifying, but possible solution on the table. They had to cut the leg off. Now, Act 3, the royal refusal. This is the moment, the turning point upon which the entire tragedy hinges. Imagine the scene. Fagin trembling, explaining that to save the king's life, they must perform an amputation. And Louis's reaction was not one of fear. It was one of pure, unadulterated royal indignation. You can almost hear him. "You want to take a saw? "To me, to the leg of the King of France." For him, this was unthinkable, and his refusal wasn't just simple stubbornness. It was rooted in the very core of his identity, in the world he had spent 72 years building. First, there was the matter of divine right. The king's body was sacred, anointed by God at his coronation. To mutilate it was a form of sacrilege. It was an insult to God himself. Second, and far more importantly, was the question of his image. His entire authority was built on the projection of strength, of wholeness, of divine perfection. How could he rule as the Sun King from a wheeled chair? How could he review his armies or lead the court in its intricate dances as a cripple? An amputated king was a diminished king, a broken symbol. In his mind, it was better to be a dead god than a living, incomplete man. His personal pride, his 76 years of being the absolute, unquestioned center of everything, made it impossible for him to accept this ultimate weakness. He had faced down armies, he had bent the will of nations. Surely he could face down a little rot in his own leg. He gave his command. There would be no amputation. The doctors were dismissed, their advice rejected. The king had made his choice. He had signed his own death warrant. The court was thrown into utter chaos. The king's will was law, but his will was now leading him directly to the grave. Act 4. The Charlatan's Elixir. With the path of official medicine blocked by royal decree, the court entered a new phase, desperation. And desperation is a breeding ground for superstition and false hope. The official doctors had failed. So the court started looking for an unofficial solution. Whispers arrived from the south, from Provence. Whispers of a man named Brun, a humble rustic man who possessed a miracle cure. A secret family recipe and elixir passed down through generations that could supposedly draw out the venom of gangrene and restore life to dying flesh. In a sane world, this would have been dismissed as the peasant nonsense it was. Fagin and the other physicians were horrified at the suggestion. It was quackery of the highest order. But the court wasn't sane. It was terrified. Powerful figures, including the king's deeply religious wife, Madame de Maintenon, began to champion the idea. What was there to lose? The king was dying anyway. Why not try a miracle? And so, Brun was summoned to Versailles. Picture this peasant probably smelling of garlic and earth being ushered through the Hall of Mirrors into the most sacred space in all of Europe. The king's bedchamber. He was given an audience. He presented his elixir, a dark, thick poultice. And in a final desperate gamble, Louis agreed to try it. And they slathered the black dying leg of the Sun King with this mysterious goo. And for a day, a single, glorious day, it seemed to work. A miracle. The king claimed the pain had lessened. He felt a surge of strength. The court exploded with joy. Brun was a hero. He had done what the finest doctors in Paris could not. Fagin and the surgeons were humiliated, their grim science defeated by a peasant's folk magic. But the triumph was short-lived. The relief was a cruel illusion, a final deceptive flicker of the candle before it goes out. The very next day, the truth was horrifyingly apparent. The blackness had not receded. It had surged up the leg with terrifying speed, now reaching the king's thigh. The elixir, far from curing him, had likely only sealed in the warmth and moisture, creating the perfect environment for the decay to accelerate. Hope was not just lost, it was brutally murdered. The door to a medical solution was now permanently closed. Act 5. The long sunset. What followed was the long goodbye. The focus of the court shifted from a frantic search for a cure to the somber, ritualized process of watching a king die. The final performance was about to begin. The sensory details from eyewitness accounts are the stuff of nightmares. The king's leg was now, by all reports, completely black, shriveled, and emitting a stench so powerful, so foul, that it saturated the opulent rooms of Versailles. Attendants burned incense and sprinkled perfume constantly, but nothing could mask the smell of death that emanated from the living king. It was the ultimate grotesque symbol, raw nature, overwhelming the most sophisticated and artificial environment on earth. But in the face of this final, undeniable defeat, Louis seemed to find a new sense of purpose. If he could not control his life, he would control his death. He met the end not with fear, but with the same methodical precision with which he had lived. He put his kingdom in order. In a scene that has become legend, he called for his 5-year-old great-grandson, the boy who would become Louis XV. He pulled the child close and gave him one last piece of royal advice. "My child," he said, "do not imitate my love for building, nor my love for war. Try to live in peace with your neighbors." It was a moment of shocking clarity of late-life regret from a man whose ambition had cost his country dearly. He held meetings with his ministers from his deathbed. He ensured the regency was secure. He gave instructions for his own funeral. And on the morning of September 1st, 1715, surrounded by the weeping court, he uttered his alleged last words. Looking at his sobbing attendants, he said, "Why do you weep? Did you think I was immortal?" And then the Sun King was gone. The man was dead. A reign that had defined an entire century was over. But the consequences of his life and his death were just beginning to unfold. A 5-year-old boy was now king of a nation that was exhausted and nearly bankrupt. And the institution of absolute monarchy, which Louis had perfected, had just shown the world its greatest weakness. What happens to a nation when its living God finally proves he is just a man? The physical rot may have ended, but the political decay, as we are about to see, was just getting started. The king is dead. The longest reign in European history is over. The story of what happened, the grim week-by-week narrative of a dying leg, is complete. And if this were a normal History Channel, we'd probably end it there. Sad story, old king, bad luck. But this is Cursed Chambers, and we don't care about the what. We care about the why. So now we enter the lab. We put on our historical detective hats. We are no longer just telling a story, we are performing a historical autopsy. The official cause of death written on the certificate was senile gangrene. And sure, medically speaking, that's correct. That's like saying the cause of death for Julius Caesar was excessive bleeding. It's true, but it misses the entire juicy, fascinating point. The real question isn't what killed him. The real question is why he was allowed to be killed in such a slow, preventable, and frankly disgusting way. The popular story is that of a tragic but noble end, a great king meeting his fate with dignity. But the truth is far more complex. The gangrene was just the weapon. The murderer wasn't a disease, it was a conspiracy of circumstances, a perfect storm of fatal flaws. And the cursed chamber where this crime took place wasn't a room in the palace. It was the palace itself. Let's open the case file and examine our evidence. Exhibit A. The hubris of the Sun King. First, we have to talk about the man himself. You cannot be the absolute, unquestioned ruler of a major world power for 72 years and remain a normal, well-adjusted human being. It's simply not possible. Power on that scale for that long warps the mind. And for Louis, it had warped his into believing his own marketing. He wasn't just a king, he was the Sun King, a title he chose for himself. He was Apollo, the Greek god of the sun, come to earth. His emblem was everywhere. He had built Versailles as a temple to himself. He had overcome every obstacle, defeated every rival, and bent the entire nation to his will. After 7 decades of reality conforming to his every desire, you can forgive the man for thinking that reality itself was simply negotiable. But as he discovered in his final weeks, biology doesn't negotiate. His refusal to allow the amputation is the absolute key to this entire mystery. And it wasn't just a moment of fear or stubbornness, it was a fundamental crisis of his entire identity. To be Louis XIV was to be whole, to be powerful, to be the divinely appointed symbol of France. In his mind, an amputated king was no longer the Sun King. He would be a broken thing, a cripple in a chair, an object of pity, not awe. Imagine the psychological dissonance. For 70 years, he was a living god. And now a grubby surgeon with a bone saw was telling him that he had to be crudely taken apart like a broken piece of furniture to survive. It didn't compute. It was an insult to his very being. So he did what he had always done when faced with an unpleasant reality. He simply denied it the power to exist. He refused. In his mind, he was choosing to die a king rather than live as a mere man. It is the single most potent act of hubris imaginable. He had become so consumed by the myth he had created that he sacrificed the man to preserve the myth. Exhibit B, the blindness of 18th century medicine. Now, it's not entirely fair to lay all the blame on Lewis's ego. We have to consider his co-conspirators in this tragedy, the doctors. And it's important to remember Fagin and his colleagues were not fools. They were the absolute best and brightest of their time. The problem is their time was medically the Dark Ages. They had no concept of germ theory. They didn't know about bacteria or infection in any way we would recognize. To them, disease was a mystical imbalance, a war of vapors and humors inside the body. Their entire medical playbook consisted of trying to violently rebalance those humors. That's why they were so obsessed with bloodletting, trying to remove excess blood, and why they were so fond of purges and enemas, trying to aggressively flush out whatever evil was lurking in the system. When faced with gangrene, they understood the basic mechanics. They could see the flesh was dying. They knew it was caused by a loss of vital heat and blood flow, but they had no idea how to stop it. Their potions, their warm compresses, these were like trying to put out a forest fire with a water pistol. This brings us to amputation. In 1715, this procedure was a nightmare. There was no anesthetic save for a bottle of brandy and a leather strap to bite down on. The patient was awake for the entire agonizing process. The risk of death from shock alone was immense. And even if you survived the surgery, the risk of the stump becoming infected and killing you days later was catastrophically high because, again, they had no concept of sterilization. So from a certain point of view, Louis's hesitation wasn't entirely crazy. It was a choice between a certain slow death and a probable very fast and excruciatingly painful death. But it was a chance, the only chance. And the fact that they so quickly abandoned this one slim scientific chance in favor of a quack with a magic potion tells you everything you need to know. The arrival of Brun wasn't an anomaly. It was a predictable symptom of a medical system that had hit the absolute limit of its knowledge. When science fails, superstition gets its moment to shine. And in this case, the results were predictably fatal. Exhibit C, the poisonous theater of power. So we have a pathologically prideful king and a tragically ignorant medical establishment. Either of these things alone might have been survivable. But when you mix them together inside the pressurized toxic environment of Versailles, you get a chemical reaction that is guaranteed to be lethal. This is our final and most important exhibit. The system itself. As we established, everything at Versailles was a performance. Nothing was private, and that included the king's slow, agonizing death. His sick room wasn't a sterile, quiet place for healing. It was the new center of the court. It was crowded with dukes, bishops, ministers, and his own family, all watching, all whispering, all maneuvering. His decision to refuse the amputation wasn't just a personal medical choice. It was a political statement performed in front of an audience of the entire nation. It was a final defiant act of kingship, a declaration that he would remain the symbol of inviolable power to the very end. And the court's reaction amplified the crisis at every turn. The moment the official doctors admitted they were stumped, different factions within the court began to push their own solutions. The promotion of the quack Dr. Brun wasn't just a desperate act of a loving wife. It was also a political move away for certain figures to gain favor by offering a miracle when the establishment could not. The king's body became a battlefield for courtly intrigue. He was trapped, utterly and completely trapped by the golden cage he had spent a lifetime building. Even if in a moment of quiet personal fear, he had wanted to reconsider, to scream, "Fine, take the damn leg, I want to live." The sheer weight of the public ritual, the constant performance of being Louis the Great, made it impossible. He had to play the part he had written for himself right up until the final curtain call. So let's step back from our autopsy table and review the findings. The killer wasn't a microbe. It wasn't a disease. The cause of death was a complex pre-existing condition, a lethal cocktail of 3 ingredients. First, the pathological pride of a man who had spent so long pretending to be a god that he forgot how to be a mortal. Second, the profound and tragic ignorance of the science and medicine of his day. And third, the poisonous theatrical political atmosphere that turned a personal health crisis into a public spectacle of death. The cursed chamber that claimed the life of Louis XIV was not a physical place. It was an idea. It was the suffocating gilded prison of absolutism. Louis XIV didn't die from gangrene. He died from an overdose of his own system. He was the first and most famous victim of the world that he alone had created. He had orchestrated his final act, and the curtain had fallen on the longest reign in history. But the story never ends with the death of the king. Because when a star, as massive, as bright, and as dense as the Sun King finally collapses, it doesn't just go dark. It leaves behind a black hole, a vacuum of power that threatens to swallow everything around it. And the legacy of that decay, the political rot that was left behind, would haunt France for the next 74 years, right up until the day his own great-great-great-grandson would have a date with a rather different kind of sharp blade. And so, the autopsy is complete. The case file on the death of Louis XIV can finally be closed. Our verdict is clear. The king was not the victim of a mysterious curse, nor was he simply a feeble old man succumbing to the inevitable decay of age. The death of the Sun King was a self-inflicted wound, a slow-motion suicide by 1,000 tiny cuts of pride. The official cause of death was gangrene, but the real cause was a toxic, entirely man-made cocktail. You take 1 part pathological hubris, the kind that can only be cultivated by 7 decades of absolute power. You mix it with 1 part primitive pre-scientific medicine, and then you pour that deadly mixture into the pressurized, poisonous political atmosphere of Versailles, the very system the king himself had designed. The result was inevitable. A death that was as grotesque and theatrical as his life had been. He chose the myth over the medicine. He chose the immaculate death of a symbol over the messy, compromised life of a man. The Sun King, the man who bent an entire nation to his will, could not command a single dying cell in his own leg to obey. He learned in the most visceral way imaginable that he was not, in fact, immortal. But the story doesn't end there. It never does. Because when a figure that colossal a star that has been the center of the political solar system for over 70 years finally extinguishes, it doesn't just go dark. It collapses in on itself, leaving behind a black hole of debt, instability, and decay that threatens to swallow the next generation whole. This is the echo, the true and terrifying legacy of the Sun King. Immediately after his death, France was plunged into uncertainty. The new King Louis XV was a 5-year-old child. A regent, the Duke of Orléans, took control, and the stiff, pious morality of Louis's later years was immediately replaced by an era of financial scandal and legendary debauchery. It was as if the entire country, after being held in a state of rigid tension for half a century, suddenly and violently exhaled. But the real legacy, the real rot that Louis left behind, was financial. It was a cancer that had been growing for decades, hidden beneath the glittering facade of Versailles. First, there were the wars. So many wars. The War of Devolution, the Franco-Dutch War, the 9 Years' War, the War of the Spanish Succession. Louis's obsession with glory and expanding his borders had cost a catastrophic amount of blood and treasure. He left the kingdom with debts that were by any modern standard completely and utterly astronomical. Then there was Versailles itself. The constant construction, the expansions, the solid silver furniture that he later had to melt down to pay for his wars, the daily relentless cost of feeding, housing, and entertaining thousands of the most useless and expensive people in the country. It was a gilded money pit, a black hole that sucked the wealth out of the French countryside and concentrated it in one single glittering spot of obscene luxury. And how did he pay for all this? By perfecting one of the most unjust and unstable tax systems ever devised. In Louis's France, the people with the most money, the nobility and the clergy, paid almost nothing in taxes. It was one of their ancient privileges. The entire financial burden of the state, the wars, the palaces, the parties, all of it fell upon the shoulders of the Third Estate, the peasants, the merchants, the working people of France. This is the true cursed inheritance of the Sun King. He left his successors a nation that was fundamentally broken. It was a kingdom that looked magnificent on the outside, a golden apple to the rest of the world, but it was rotting from the core. His great-grandson Louis XV and his great-great-grandson Louis XVI spent their entire reigns wrestling with this one unsolvable problem, the national debt. Every time they tried to reform the system to make the nobles pay their fair share, they were blocked by the very aristocracy that Louis XIV had created, an aristocracy that would rather see the country burn than give up a single one of their precious tax-exempt privileges. And so, the stage was set for 1789. The French Revolution was not born in a vacuum. It was born in the shadow of Versailles, the image of the extravagant, out-of-touch monarchy living in a bubble of unimaginable wealth while the people starved became the central rallying cry for the revolutionaries. And that image, that symbol of royal decadence, was a direct, handcrafted creation of Louis XIV. The very excesses that defined his glory in the 17th century became the justification for the complete destruction of the monarchy in the 18th. The rot that began in his leg had, over the course of 74 years, finally consumed the entire body politic. And this brings us to our final human insight, the ultimate bitter irony of the life and death of Louis XIV. This was a man obsessed above all else with control. He sought to control nature itself, forcing the landscape of France into the rigid, geometric perfection of his gardens at Versailles. He sought to control society, trapping his nobility in a web of ritual and etiquette. He sought to control his own image, crafting the persona of the Sun King, a living god on earth. His entire life was a testament to the power of human will to impose order on a chaotic world. And his death was the ultimate humiliating lesson that this control is and always will be an illusion. He could command the sun to be his emblem, but he couldn't command the blood to flow to his own foot. He could build the grandest palace in human history, but he couldn't stop his own bedroom from filling with the undeniable stench of his own mortality. He who had mastered the art of public performance was forced to play out the most private and disgusting of human frailties on the world's biggest stage. It is a chilling and profound reminder that beneath the crowns, beneath the silk and gold, beneath the grand pronouncements of divine right, we are all just biology. Every king, every emperor, every tyrant, and every self-proclaimed god on earth is just a temporary collection of cells, an intricate machine that is inevitably destined to break down. No amount of power, no amount of wealth can grant you a permanent exemption from that simple, democratic, and terrifying truth. What do you think? Was Louis XIV a tragic hero, a victim of his time? Or was he the arrogant architect of his own disgusting demise? Let us know your verdict in the comments below. And if you want to continue exploring the darkest and most fascinating corners of the past, make sure you subscribe to Cursed Chambers and ring that bell. The past is always waiting to be unearthed.